Now here you will understand the interconnection of all the networks, how internet service providers engage themselves with other internet service providers, where they set up their infrastructure, how they set up their infrastructure, and what drives this complex network structure. What are all those driving factors which motivates them to engage with other internet service providers, and how does all they create this complex web. So to understand this, we will start from scratch. So initially just assume that there are isolated networks. There are isolated local area networks. So suppose if there are n number of institutes, they all have their own individual local area networks. Now they want to connect amongst themselves. How that thing is possible? One thing is that all these institutes will set up a line and interconnect themselves from, so one institute will interconnect with n minus 1, and likewise all n minus 1 will connect with all other institute. So that is one possibility. Then the connection from one endpoint to another endpoint will be possible, but that would require a lot of infrastructure, that would require a lot of wire deployment, switching network, so that would be too complex. And then the next possibility is that, based on the economics, based on the availability of access internet service providers, that institute or that individual for that matter will have an access to the access internet service provider or the residential internet service providers. So you are directly connected as an individual or an institute where you are maintaining a LAN and you want to have an access to the internet. You're directly connected to the access internet service providers. So that is the first engagement. So you're connected through your edge router to the nearby access service provider whom you have subscribed to. Now suppose there are n number of access service providers, access internet service providers, and obviously one institute is connected to one access service provider, another institute is connected to another access service providers, or it may be so that suppose 3 or 4 institute are connected to one access service provider. So amongst 3 or 4 institute, whenever they have to communicate, they can communicate through the same access provider whom they all subscribe to. So that limited connectivity will be there amongst 3 or 4 institute which are subscribed to single access provider. But the problem will start when you have to connect to some other institute which have subscribed to some other access service providers. So in other way, then there comes another requirement where all these access service providers somehow should be interconnected. How that thing is possible? So I'm giving you one imaginary scenario that how that thing is possible. It may be possible that there comes one big organization who set up its own infrastructure all across the world and interconnect these access service providers amongst themselves. So in a way, all these access service providers would be customer to that internet service provider, the global service provider. We are naming that global service provider as a tier 1 internet service providers. But then the problem comes because there will be only single organization and all other access internet service providers are directly connected to the single tier 1 internet service provider, then there will be monopoly, because then that internet service provider at the tier 1 will charge the access internet service provider based on their infrastructure, the engagement, not based on the data traffic which those access service provider will pass on through the infrastructure set up by the tier 1 internet service provider. Then it will be based only on the connection. So if that access service providers want to interconnect, then it has to pay based on the connections, not based on the volume of the traffic which it will pass through the network. So that is not feasible, and that is not economical also. And if it would be economical for tier 1 single organizations, and then obviously other organizations will come in the business, other organizations will also set up their infrastructure, and then they will also approach these access service providers as their customers. So other business organizations will also participate in the business, and they will also create infrastructure. So in a way, tier 1 internet service providers are many in number, though they are big in size, and sometimes they cover the whole continent, sometimes they cover big cities, but their presence is not so wide scale so as to call it global in its name. So they have wide presence, but if you will club all the tier 1 internet service provider, then they have the global presence. But it may be possible that one organization which is the part of tier 1 internet service provider may not have presence in some specific countries, because it is all governed through economics, so through business. So if they will not find it economically viable to set up their infrastructure in some countries, they will not do it. So there is a vacuum in those countries or in those regions where definitely their customers also there, the access providers who want some kind of infrastructure so as to connect them to the tier 1 infrastructure. Then that vacuum been filled through regional internet service providers. It may be possible. I mean, you can't just name anything regional service provider just by the name itself, regional. So different regional internet service providers may have different size of presence. One regional service provider may have presence even all across the country, that may be possible, and even that regional service provider may have capacity to serve only across the state. It may be possible, but for the namesake, for understanding purpose, so in between access network and the tier 1 network, there is someone like regional internet service providers. So regional internet service providers have customers in terms of their who are connected uh, to them as access internet service providers or residential service providers. And under internet, these access internet service providers, so we are connected to them. Enterprises are connected to them, and institutes are connected to them. Individuals are connected to them, and in this way this whole setup is there. Now there is a customer, and means These access service providers are customer to regional internet service providers. These regional service providers are customer to tier 1 internet service providers. So that relationship is there based on that uh, customership relationship is there in between regional and access and tier 1 and regional. So the volume, based on the volume of the traffic which the regional internet service provider will pass through the tier 1 will charge the regional service providers. Based on what access internet service provider will pass through the regional service providers will charge access service providers, and here we subscribe to them based on the plans. So if you want more bandwidth, you require more services, you have to pay more to the access service provider. So in this way, your money trickles up to the regional, then tier 1. Now, how they are connected? On what basis regional service providers would connect with a tier 1 service provider? It is not based on solely based on performance. It is more based on the national policies and business policies. Because for this regional, if you'll consider this regional internet service provider, it has several choices as a tier 1 service providers. So it can choose anyone based on its national policy as well as its business policy, economic policies. Based on that, it will engage with it. And because it is providing services, so to the access service providers, it want to give service without any fault. So it may be possible that if this regional service provider is connected to this only single tier 1 service provider, so if it is connected to a single service provider, if by any chance tier 1 service providers has not been able to serve the regional internet service provider at a certain time due to some technical glitches, due to some destruction there, natural disaster, it may be possible then in that situation this service provider will not be able to serve its access service provider, and eventually it will trickle down to us. We will not be able to access the internet. That's why in many of the situations, if they're highly professional, they go for several connections. That is called multi-homing. So they multi-home with several tier 1 service provider. Likewise, access service providers also multi-home with, they can directly connect it with based on the availability. If tier 1 service provider is near to you, you can multi-home with tier 1 service provider. So there is no well-defined rule that you have to follow strictly the hierarchy that tier 1 will not be able to directly connect with the access service provider. Yeah, access service provider can also multi-home with several tier 1, and even as an individual also you can multi-home with several access service provider. So if one access service provider is not give you 100% reliability, then you can go for several access service providers, which may also then eventually multi-home with several regional ISPs, and those regional ISPs can also multi-home with tier 1 ISPs. So multi-homing is a concept so as to tolerate the fault. So for fault tolerance, if to ensure reliability, to ensure reliable connection, you go for multi-homing. Then there comes one more concept that because these tier 1 ISPs or these regional ISPs, there is a customer based relationship. Um, so they are charging them based on the volume of traffic which is passing through these tier 1 ISPs. So suppose if from this access ISP, so someone is here, down here, it is directly connected to this access ISP and want to have a connection with someone who is sitting here connected to this access ISP. So one scenario is there that once you will send a message or a traffic to this access service provider, this will pass it on to the regional internet service provider. Now it has two options. This regional service provider will either can pass it on to the tier, from tier it can come back and then pass it on to this access service provider and eventually to the user. But there may be the tie-up between the regional ISPs that whenever I will have a packet for your access internet service provider, I will pass it on to you. That is called the peering concept. So instead of passing it to the tier one internet service provider, I will pass it on to the regional service provider near to me, who eventually will pass it on to the destined access internet service provider, and eventually access internet service provider will pass it on to the destination node. So what it will save, so obviously in that situation you are not sending anything to the tier one internet service provider, so tier one internet service provider will not charge for you, and it's a sort of a peering. You can do it for this regional ISP, and for this regional ISP you can do it, so vice versa you can be interdependent, so you will not even charge for that. So freely you can peer it. It may be possible that you can peer it with tier one if tier one is interested in you. So it is purely based on economics, what sort of a deal goes into it, business dealing. So regional ISPs can also peer with tier one ISPs. Sometimes there may be a direct connection, so you don't require any sort of if that is more technical concept, that when you will directly communicate with the regional ISP or when you will communicate with internet exchange point IXPs. So it is also one of the domain, one of the field which facilitates peering. So it is the business domain in which the companies deal with, and there are several companies who set up their internet exchange point through which peering is possible. So they keep track of the things, that how much volume you are transferring, or the volume of traffic you are transferring. So all these things. So through IXP also you can have an interconnection, for peering, or directly also you can have the peering concept. So peering concept in a way reduce the cost of serving your customers. So all the companies look for it through business deals. Then there comes one more. Finally, I want to introduce with the content provider. So this is a recent phenomena in 10-15 years. So probably I think in last 7-8 years, Google, Facebook, they have also set up their data centers all across the world, and they have set up their own infrastructure, and their user base is also more. So here down access network, majority of the time we want to access Google, majority of the time many of the users want to access Facebook. They have their data centers, servers run up there. So one possibility is there that we all will access it through tier one. Then these content providers, when they are connected to it and their traffic is going through tier one ISPs, so obviously they have to pay something to the tier one ISPs as well. So instead of avoiding that, they directly peer with the regional ISPs. They say that will not charge, means they directly, because these regional ISPs always look for peering, because through peering they can reduce their cost of operations. So what is the recent phenomena which is coming up? These content providers try to engage more with the regional ISPs directly, or either through internet exchange point IXPs, and they want to minimize their contact, their engagement with the tier one. It is not so that their engagement is not there, but they want to reduce the traffic through the tier one ISP so as to pay them less, because now it is based on the volume of traffic. It's not based just on the engagement or the connection. It is based on the volume of traffic which you will pass through the tier 1 ISPs. So that is something interesting, that for business purpose, they have their network all across. So internally they use their own network for sending up their packet, but obviously we all are behind access internet service provider or residential service providers which are connected to regional ISPs. So they also want to be connected and be the part of internet. So their idea is for reducing their cost of operation. Instead of paying them the tier 1 ISPs, they want to peer directly, freely. They want to peer either through IXP or directly to the regional ISP, and sometimes even based on the availability, if it is near to you, you can directly peer with the access service provider, because there you don't have to pay them anything. It is peering, and it is mutually beneficial for both the parties, but it is not beneficial for the tier 1 ISPs. Yeah, this is all about the current infrastructure setup in today's time. Hope you would have understood it. And next we will understand, I think we have already understood delay, loss, throughput. We have to understand in packet switch network, what is the throughput. And once again, we will revisit all the delays and why there is a loss in packets. All that we'll study in the next lecture.